I'm really excited for today. I'm excited to hear Chuck's answers to all our questions.
And thanks for joining us, Micah. Micah is going to help us understand some of the aspects as we talk about some of the insurance implications and the financial planning implications. And so we wanted to start out by talking about, what are the essential steps to forming a business succession plan? So if you are really starting from ground zero and you don't know what the succession plan for your business is going to look like, where would you begin to unpack this? And how would you begin to start to make decisions that would lead you toward having a business succession plan? And really, there are three specific kind of ways to group this together so that you can make it a little bit more manageable. And it really begins first by defining your long-term personal and business goals. And so I work on the corporate side, and Micah works very much on the business side, and Chuck is the person who helps to tie this all together and helps put a bow on it for people. But it really begins by kind of looking inward and deciding, what do we want this to look like? And if you're the person who's exiting, what do you want the rest of your life to look like? What do you want your planning to look like? And also answering questions about, how much money do you need to live the lifestyle that you want? What's the right timing for you to make an exit? And then looking critically at who within your family or outside your family are potential options for succession. And we're going to talk a lot about that today as well. And then from that starting place of what are our goals, we can begin to work with you to say, how do we develop a management plan for your business currently? And how do we lead that into a plan that is a succession plan? And so a lot of this has to do not just with what's the actual succession plan, but how are you going to manage the business up to that point of succession? Because often you're going to have somebody that you really need to help learn the business, somebody that might need training, additional training, or might need additional capacity. You may look as you go through this process and realize that you're going to need an additional role in your business that you didn't have previously. Maybe you've been doing something that's very specialized, or where you're an expert and the person who you have designed to take over is not an expert in that area. And so you might need to make real changes to your business model to make this successful. And those are the kinds of decisions that we help business owners through. And then Chuck helps put this in the context of an estate plan. So how do you transition ownership of the business in a way that meets your goals? And we'll talk about the timing of that transition. Sometimes people are planning to make that transition prior to their death, so they can get everything wrapped up and the transition kind of has already taken place. A lot of times people are planning what will happen when they pass away, and what does that transition opportunity look like after their death. And there's not really a right answer there. There are certainly tax and estate planning implications for the timing of those decisions, and Chuck's going to talk a little bit about that with us today. But this is kind of the framework that we wanted to work through when we talk about what are the steps that you might take as a business owner trying to decide, how do I plan to transition this business? So what is succession planning? Here we're talking about transitioning closely held business interests. So these are typically family businesses. And it can be a business that's been in your family for generations. So you might be a second, third, fourth, fifth, or even longer generation business owner. Or it might be a business that you bought. It didn't start in your family, but you purchased it and you've been running it. And so now it's a family business. And so sometimes I think people only think about family business as the business that you might have gotten through succession from an earlier family member. But the reality is, any business that you run for yourself and have intention to transition to people in your family is a family business. And it's those types of closely held business interests that we're talking about. And what we really want to do is we want to plan for a smooth transition, and we want that transition to be planned. And Chuck, I think that's probably a great point for you to talk a little bit about the importance of that planning, and maybe even some of the things that we've seen in our practice for when that planning doesn't take place, because those examples, I think, illustrate why it's so important to have a plan.
Absolutely. was very, very good on how you define that. When I think of succession planning at its pure definition, it really gets to the heart of it has to be smooth and planned. Technically, a plan is not making a decision. That doesn't mean it's a succession plan. Far too often, we'll find family businesses that they're focused on paying the bottom line, making payroll, managing their business month to month, and they're not focused on what's the next step if something happens to me, whether it's a disability, whether I pass away, how am I going to transition this business, if I'm going to retire, sell, or do I have a family member infused in the business that I'm going to succeed it onto, and strategize that to be smooth. And far too often we will find without a plan, it basically creates a wrench thrown into the rails, so to speak, and can trigger, the unfortunate event of what I call a dissolution that's untimed, and, for lack of a better term, not to scare our audience, but the fire sale, where family members, whoever's going to legacy that person who did not have a plan to that business, is essentially terminating the lease or putting the property up for sale, closing the doors, terminating, selling inventory, depending on the type of business, closing down relationships, and pretty much just having a fire sale that, one, isn't going to maximize the value of that loved one's business, isn't going to monetize it in any way, really, other than maybe a discount, pennies on the dollar from the fire sale standpoint. So it's essentially making sure that you have those thoughts sooner as opposed to later, to make sure that is a smooth and planned transition. Far too often business owners, like I said, they always think, well, I'll think about that when I'm ready to retire. Well, when is that going to be? Nobody really knows when they're going to just say, hey, I'm done. Is it going to just flip overnight? And flipping the switch on a succession plan overnight isn't the smoothest transition, as we know as professionals. So there's a lot to it. There's a lot of pieces to that transition. So making sure that you have a team of advisors that are help guiding you through it, and getting to the core questions. And sometimes you don't know the questions to ask or to analyze. So that's why you need this team in place. But really, specifically zoning in to start thinking about these issues. If you're not going to be around, what's going to happen? Sometimes it's a sale. Sometimes it's a gift. Sometimes it's a transition period post-death to make sure there's a planned sale. And, sometimes it's a buyout. There's all different flavors to succession planning, and I know we'll get into some of those topics today, but it's really never too early to start talking about succession planning. I know one of the key questions I get a lot from business owner clients of the firm and myself is, well, when should I start thinking about this? Well, you can actually start thinking about this before you even start the business. And sometimes that's the easiest time to start thinking about it, because everybody agrees when we're starting. But yeah, so when I think of succession planning, Jacquelyn, I think you hit the nail on the head with your slide previously that said smooth and planned, without a doubt.
And, having a team in place is such an important aspect. I think sometimes we see that people who are in this position don't know what they don't know, and they need help. I just recently talked to someone who had been a lifelong friend of mine, and her father had passed away, and he had an insurance business. And it was a very, very, very successful insurance business. I mean, he was the go-to guy in what was admittedly a relatively small town, but he had hundreds of personal and business clients that all got their insurance through him. And I talked to a couple of people after her dad's death who had said, you know, we had to get a new insurance agent. And I thought, oh, well, you know, I guess maybe they didn't like the person who purchased the practice. And then I talked to her and I said, you know, who ended up taking over your dad's practice? And she said, well, no one. We just shut the business down. And I said, why would you shut the business down? And she said, well, he didn't really own anything. He just had this big list of customers. And to us, that sounds almost funny because that big list of customers was very valuable. And there were a lot of other insurance agents in town who would have paid good money for that big list of customers. And so the family just, they didn't ask questions and they didn't know what they didn't know. And so knowing things like what the value of this might be or what the capabilities are to transition it, sometimes there's a lot more opportunity than people really think. And we're helping someone else transition a business right now that is a business that really needed to be revitalized. But somebody is buying it who has greater technical skills and is bringing in some new equipment. And so that business has some real value. And the owner that's selling that business, his plan was to shut the business down before this person who works there approached him about buying the business because he thought the business had become outdated and it didn't have a lot of value. And so there's really a lot of opportunity that sometimes people don't see to transition businesses in really positive ways. And that's the reason this team is so important. And Micah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role that you all play in this process.
Yeah, absolutely. And our experience is very similar when we come across business owners. And I think we've said previously on the other webinars we've done, business owners are a special breed of people. They're unique. They're not the 9-to-5ers. They're pouring their heart and soul into their craft and what they're creating, which is amazing. And as Chuck alluded to earlier, sometimes they get so zeroed in on the day-to-day and what do I need to do to make this work and provide for my family and grow the business that they don't take the time to educate themselves, talk to the proper people, and before they know it, they get to the point where it's like, hey, I want to transition out, and then there's no plan, so it's clunky and it's a fire sale and all those fun things. And I do want to encourage you, you're listening to this and you're like, I haven't thought about this. That's okay. Like, that's why we're here. That's why you have a team of experts. You're not supposed to know everything. You're supposed to be great at what you do, which you are. If you're a business owner of a successful business, that's what you do. We're here to help you go through that. So from my perspective as a financial advisor, we're starting with, again, the goal. What do we actually want life to be like? And we're going to work towards that. Unfortunately, a lot of times people are just thinking in terms of, hey, what's the most I can get from my business? Well, that might not be the right plan depending on what your goals are. I know I have a ton of business owners in my family. Most of them, they want to, when they say they're going to retire, then they think about it and they're like, actually, I get really bored. So maybe I'm going to sell my business, but I'm going to do something else. I'm going to consult. I'm going to go buy a new business. Even though I don't have to, I'm financially secure, I still want to do something. And all of those things are really, really important for us to build a good financial plan and make sure that we're not structuring your deal incorrectly, or that we're planning your finances and the way we're investing in a way that doesn't actually line up with your ultimate objective. I always say numbers are half the battle, but personality is the other half. We have to really know who you are. And that's the process that our team takes our clients through, is understanding who you are as a person, what you're trying to accomplish, why is it important to you that the business stays in the family, all those sorts of things. Because that's just as important when we're making financial recommendations as what do the numbers say and how much money do we need in a pot to make sure that you can live the lifestyle that you envision.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Micah. It's definitely an important component. So we've been talking about why you plan your transition in terms of why do you want to have this plan. But one of the reasons we want to really highlight here is this idea that you will never know exactly when you need it. And we all want to assume that nothing untoward is going to happen to us, but you really can, as Chuck mentioned, throw a spanner in the works, right? A wrench in the works when you have an event and you don't have a plan. And so that is really the main reason, is that you can't predict. And so a lot of people think they're going to work in their business for many more years, and then something happens and there's some unfortunate event that means they can't, and they don't have a path that's best for them to exit. And so that's why this planning is so important. And then the other thing is that there are real estate planning implications, and that's the real reason we have Chuck with us here today. That's his area of expertise. He is truly the best at this. And so Chuck, can you talk a little bit about some of those estate planning implications of failing to plan, or the benefits, the estate planning benefits of having a great plan?
Absolutely. So the first time I ever meet a business owner to start talking about estate planning, I always tell them, congratulations, you made the first best step to start the discussion, without a doubt. But every business owner needs an estate plan. Every individual needs an estate plan, but every business owner needs an estate plan. And part of that estate planning gravitates to succession planning. And some of the things that you alluded to with a couple of your statements, Jacquelyn, really resonate, because if you don't have a plan and something happens unfortunate, like you become incapacitated or unable to make your own decisions while you're alive, disabled, unable to work in the same role that you are currently working in your business, and say you're the key decision maker, how is that going to transition? Sometimes we need to utilize powers of attorney, and sometimes they're limited in scope, whether they're business decisions versus personal decisions. Those are really important because they would avoid the triggering of court petitioning process called a guardianship. Technically, if you're an adult and you became incapacitated and you don't have those documents in place, it triggers a guardianship formally. And now you have the courts appointing an individual that hopefully aligned with your intent but nobody knows what that intent is because you haven't planned it. So that's an example during lifetime. But what if you pass away at your desk, and who's going to take it over? Your will. If you do not have an estate plan, or if you have a basic estate plan, your will might catch it. It might fall into those decision owners, based on the terms of your will. You also may have a business planning document that you set up when you established your business, that you might not have been thinking about these things when you established it. It might have been boilerplate. It might not have been fine-tuned. You might have added on partners that you weren't sure whether or not they were going to take your interests. So all these different things can be in play. If you don't have a plan, you want to make sure that these decisions follow your intent. So it is really important from an estate planning document standpoint that you have a foundational plan that governs your goals while you're alive and when you pass away, so that it is smooth decision in operation of that business for not only your best interest, but the best interest of the business and your goals while you're alive and when you pass away. And I haven't even mentioned a word about tax yet. So
Right. And you mentioned something, a business implication, Chuck, that I think is worth briefly talking about. You talked about people bringing partners into the business. And so one of the unintended consequences that we see when people don't have planning on the business side is that if something happens and someone passes away unexpectedly, those partners sometimes become partners with someone's spouse. They become partners with someone's children, and maybe that spouse or those children don't know anything about the business. Maybe they don't have the expertise. Maybe they're not going to be engaged. And so you can find yourself quickly in business with somebody you don't intend to be in business with. So it's not just your own planning, but if you're one of those partners, you really want to encourage that kind of business planning, Because if there isn't that kind of business planning and something happens to one of your partners, you may also end up in a situation that was really not intended. And so thinking through not just the implications when something happens to you as an individual, but what are the implications if you're in a business that has more than one partner or member or shareholders? What are the implications if something happens to the people with whom you are in business? And that's another aspect of this that requires planning to avoid these kind of unforeseen circumstances. We'll let Lucy take us onward to the next slide now. So when to plan. So talking about those partnership implications or membership implications, when you have more than one member involved, when do you plan? Well, as Chuck mentioned earlier, one of the easiest times to plan is when you are at startup, when you're creating a business or buying a business, because then everyone is in agreement and it's easy to make these decisions. No one is emotionally charged. Everyone is pulling along or headed in the same direction. It's the easiest time to make the decisions. Frequently, they get made as part of estate planning for business owners. So often, Chuck on the estate side will get us involved on the business side when people come in to do their estate plan, and Chuck is able to talk them through the fact that there are going to be business implications. And then sometimes people don't really, it's not a part of their estate planning. They just start thinking, what's going to happen with this business? And they decide, particularly if there's more than one owner, that they need to make arrangements later. They need to review their business documents and update those. A lot of people, honestly, don't even know where their business documents are, let alone what they say. And so if you're listening right now and you're thinking, I don't really know where my business documents are, or I don't know what my business documents say about this, you would be in the majority of the people, not the minority of the people. Many business owners, as Chuck said earlier, you're so focused on paying the bills and operating the business and getting things done that you don't necessarily, you're not focused on what are these kinds of contingencies. So finding out where those documents are, what they say, and what you have in place is also kind of a great start. So here we're going to talk about one of the ways that you can plan, and that is through buy-sell agreements. And so Chuck, do you want to talk a little bit here about what a buy-sell agreement is and why people might want one?
Absolutely. So a buy-sell agreement is essentially terms of an agreement that dictate what occurs upon a triggering event. And as your slide shows, certain triggering events in life could be conditioned into the agreement to determine when a business owner's interest is purchased or sold to another partner is one solution. If there's another partner, essentially, if the partner's not buying it, sometimes it's the company buying it back as an alternative. But they all are focused on a triggering event. And this sometimes is actually wrapped in a provision in your business planning document. So like Jacquelyn had mentioned, it's really important if you're a business owner to pull those business planning documents out, what you started with. Usually you're going to find at least your formation documents, whether you're, a corporation, an S Corp or a C Corp, or if you're an LLC, a limited liability company. It's really important to pull those business planning documents out. And they're going to sound like shareholders agreement, or if you're an LLC, it's going to be titled a members agreement, or sometimes if it's really basic, it might be just inside what we call an operating agreement. So it's really important to pull those documents out, but those provisions could be tailored in that document. Sometimes they're their own standalone buy-sell agreement where it just sets forth the terms. But it's basically thinking ahead and building a provision that sets forth the sale of an exiting interest in a business depending on a triggering event. Those triggering events that are listed here: death, disability, divorce, bankruptcy, or legal proceedings. So I always say these are the things that can come up at any time in life, untimely, usually. Nobody really plans for any of these, okay? So as a business owner, so it's really important to think ahead if this happens to make sure that it doesn't cause an unfortunate or unsmooth transition of that business. And it also makes sure if you have more than one business owner in a business, that they are not making an agreement, like Jacquelyn said, of being in business with someone else, the other partner's estate, the other partner's ex-wife, okay, or ex-husband, ex-spouse, or that person commits, that business partner does something that was immoral or fraudulent, or did something that was not what they as a mission, as a business, agreed to be in business together on. Could be a triggering event through legal proceedings, bankruptcy, if there was an unfortunate strain related to a partner and they get involved in some personal financial strain, and they have to have a bankruptcy, a trustee appointed over their affairs, that can cause a really adverse impact on a business. And what this buy-sell provision essentially does is make sure that that partner is bought out smoothly in an appropriate manner that the business can handle, or the surviving partner or business owner can handle, and it's planned.
And then talking about this in the context of transitioning family businesses, if you are transitioning to family, those buy-sell agreements can dictate who the people are to whom the business will be sold and under what terms. And so you have a lot of control in advance to really plan this, both with somebody who is going to do your wealth management with a wealth advisor, as well as with an estate planning attorney, to figure out how this fit into the whole picture and what's that buyout look like. And so that's why this is so important. This type of agreement is so important.
Yeah, and let me chime in here just for 1 minute. Can you go back to that other slide? Thank you so much. So why is this important to have an advisor or wealth management person on your team? Because these documents, so let's just use an example. Let's say Jacquelyn and I are in business together and something happens to me, I pass away, and let's say our business is worth $1 million. Well, as Jacquelyn alluded to previously, if we didn't do any planning, my wife would become the owner of my part of the business. If with this buy-sell agreement, though, we've agreed ahead of time, if something happens to me, Jacquelyn is going to buy my portion of the business from my wife so that my wife doesn't have to worry about it, but she's compensated for the value of my business. Well, what if Jacquelyn is unable for one reason or another to fund that buyout? We now are in a more difficult situation. So when you have these buy-sells in place, it's very important for us to create a funding plan, not just a buyout plan. We need to make sure that it's funded in one way, shape, or form. And there's different ways to do that in different of these scenarios. Depending on what that triggering event is, we can do different things. But it is important not just say, hey, I've got a buy-sell. That's awesome. That's a great first step. We need to do that. But how do you know that that person that you're in business with actually has the capacity to fund their part if something were to happen? So that's important to plan for as well, not just putting it in place.
That's an excellent point. And that's the reason why, that's exactly the reason that Micah and I started doing these webinars together, honestly, is because we get involved with helping people in different ways figure out what's that look like? What's the planning for that funding look like? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along as well. And so often family dynamics come into play here, and we will talk with business owners who say, well, I have 3 kids, but I only have one child that's involved in the family business. Or, boy, I have a child who really wants to run this business, but I think he's not really ready for prime time, right? And so those situations are also very common, and they are the reason planning is important. When you have multiple children and only one child involved, estate planning can be a great tool, along with working with a wealth manager. You see all these connections between the 3 of us But estate planning and insurance, these are vehicles that you can use to make sure that everybody gets the same compensation if you have multiple children and you want to ensure they're all treated the same. And there are frequently unintended consequences if you plan this without advice. And some of that comes because of assets that transition through the estate. And so if you have an agreement that you own as joint tenants with right of survivorship, and your one son that's involved in the business is going to get the business if something happens to you, that happens outside the estate. And so there's no taxes paid on that. Things that go through the state may very well implicate inheritance tax or be subject to other taxes. And so you really want to look at the assets that you have that are available to give, and you want to make sure that it's not just the monetary amount that's equal, because the monetary value of your business, the value of a life insurance policy, the value of a 401k that hasn't yet been taxed, those are all very different values. If you have $100,000 in those three categories, it's not $100,000 each. There are implications there that really need to be considered. And that's the reason why Chuck's role in this is so important, to really help people understand what the real value of those assets will be if something happens to them. Because frequently it's not the dollar value, and frequently the value varies depending on the kind of asset.
Absolutely, Jacquelyn. And I'll just kind of build off of what you just said. I mean, there is a lot of alignment to this, particularly when we get into the concept in the example that you utilize with one child. And it happens more often than you think. So everybody that's listening, you know, if there's multiple children in the family, every parent's dream is they're all going to be part of the business and do what I do. But, you know, I grew up in a family business. And I had two brothers. One works in the business, and myself and my little brother, we do not. So we are that typical example, and that happens very, very frequently. The good news is that I can tell our listeners, if there's one, we can build a plan around that, okay, without a doubt. And even if there isn't one, we can still build a plan. But in that example, there's a lot of strategy. You know, perfect world environment, every parent wants to give equal share to every child. It's just a common theme. But like Jacquelyn said, we got to look at capital gains tax. We got to look at income tax analysis. We got to look at death tax analysis. Sometimes it depends on the jurisdiction that the business owner lives in. You know, we're sitting here in Pennsylvania right now. We have this thing called inheritance tax that I believe only 11 states in the country have. And there's different tax rates depending on who's receiving the business. We also have a family business inheritance tax exemption that has a 7-year string on it. So, you know, if it continues as a family business. So knowing some of these strategies to build in depending on the layering of the plan. And who's going to get the business, who's not going to get the business, you know, and if it's a buyout, sometimes it's a buyout during lifetime. Is it fair that the other kids are getting equal value when one kid's doing all the work to earn the revenue or build up that business post buyout? So looking at potentially maybe even discounting methods on what the actual value of that business should be. So, you know, Micah had mentioned with the buy-sell provision, the funding requirements is really important too, depending on what the family goals are, to make sure that each piece of this succession planning puzzle is customized and aligned to what the dynamic is.
And so we just talked about some of these options here for how and when there can be transitions, but to deal with some of those disparities that Chuck was just talking about, there are different ways that these things can be transitioned. So it can be as a buyout, it can be as a gift during life. So I think sometimes people think about giving things to people on their death, and there can be tax implications as well, where it could be advantageous to give that gift during someone's life. And so there are definitely strategies that you need to think through that impact the timing of these as well.
Yeah, real quick, Jacquelyn, just to give our audience some idea of what we're talking and describing from a gift, like a numbers standpoint. There's a lot of discussion right now on gifting. It's a hot button issue. You can Google a million articles on it right now because of the implications that it could be changing. But every individual can give any other individual up to $15,000 every year and not have to file anything or report anything to the IRS. We call that an annual exclusion. But that's really not what we're talking about here when it comes to a business, because most businesses are worth a lot more than $15,000. So we're getting into lifetime gifting. And every individual right now has, per Congress and our current tax plan that was implemented in 2018, called the Tax Jobs and Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And I know that sounded as clear as mud, but it was implemented by the Trump administration, and it doubled everybody's lifetime unified credit. And why it's considered unified is you can either give it away while you're alive, or whatever you haven't given away at death you can give. Okay, and that number right now in 2021 is $11.7 million. It's the highest it's ever been. But there's a sunset provision in that tax plan. And what that basically means to all the listeners is the time's running out on these cushions of numbers. And it's really important to start these discussions if you're intending to transition wealth or transition a family business, because the sunset provision basically says come January 1st, 2026, that number will reduce back to where it was, or sunset back to where it was in 2017, which was 5.49 million, plus index with inflation. So we might get somewhere between 6 and 7 million per individual. It's a lot different from 11.7. So that $5 million cushion just pretty much just gets wiped. And that's not the only scare when it comes to tax change. The current administration is proposing legislation that would reduce that exemption. And one of the rumor mills is that it could come back to $3.5 million per individual. So it's important to know these numbers, because when we get into valuing a business for a business owner, that's basically the amount of money that you can give to a loved one, to a friend, a family member, a third party that's someone other than you, trust for the benefit of someone else, someone other than you, in a gifting strategy, and do it tax-free. Once you get over those numbers, we're now getting into tax from a death or gift tax standpoint. And when you get over those numbers, it gets heavy. It's a 40% tax rate now. So that's another reason why it's really important to have a team around you, and you're not just starting to transition documents on your own or the do-it-yourself type of business owner. It's really important that you have this analyzed, valued properly. You know, things can be gifted with discounts and tailored depending on how it's structured. So it's very important to have professionals like Micah, Jacquelyn, myself, an accountant. Sometimes you need a banker, essentially to formulate a structured plan if you're getting into a gift analysis.
Yeah, and let me just drive one point home. You know, we don't have a crystal ball. Chuck, Jacquelyn, and I aren't here saying we know exactly what's going to happen, but I can promise you things are changing, and you need to make sure you have the right people around you who are aware of what the changes are and how it's going to affect your specific situation. So even if you've done this before and you like, hey, I feel like I've got a pretty good estate plan in place, things are changing. We don't know exactly what those changes are yet, but they are changing. So over the next few years, you're going to want to look at this again, regardless of whether you've done it or not.
Yeah, that's great advice, Micah. So we started to talk a little bit, and I'm going to throw this back to Micah here. We started to talk a little bit earlier about how do you fund this buyout and what does that look like? So Micah, can you talk to us about some of the funding options on the insurance side?
Yeah, absolutely. So insurance is one of the least expensive and most tax efficient ways to fund these situations. Now, again, in the example I used earlier, if Jacquelyn happens to have $1 million lying around, no big deal. Like, we don't have to worry about this. But in general, if we're seeing a business that's valued at $1 million or $2 million, it's unlikely that the business owner has that amount sitting around in cash. I don't think I've ever seen that. So how do we do that? How do we take a small amount of money or a small pot of money and turn it into a large amount of money when necessary? Well, that's what insurance is. So let's talk about Keyman Life Insurance specifically. So again, we'll use the same example. Jacquelyn and I are running a business together, and I have a life insurance policy taken out on Jacquelyn, and Jacquelyn has a life insurance policy taken out on me. So we'll use those numbers. She has to pay my wife $1 million if something happens to me. Well, instead of her just having to have $1 million sitting in the bank, she can buy a policy on my life because we have a business interest in one another. That way, when I pass away, she actually gets paid $1 million from my policy, and that then can be paid to my wife. Now, there are ways to structure that it can go directly to my wife and other things to mitigate potential tax issues. There's lots of different ways to do it, but that's essentially the concept, is where one party has an insurance policy or is paying for an insurance policy on the other party, so that if something happens to that party, the other individual has the funds now to fulfill their obligation in the buyout that they have set in place. Again, if you're independently wealthy, you've got the $1 million sitting around and you don't need it, that's awesome. Let's talk about other estate planning issues if that's the case. But in general, we're not seeing that. You have to find an inexpensive and tax efficient way to fund these buyouts, and insurance is the best way to do it in the current way that the laws and things are structured.
So another way that this can be done is through a structure of a promissory note or deferred compensation. These are things that happen within the business where payments can be structured to happen over time. Sometimes they can be structured to happen out of the revenue of the business. So somebody comes in and they step in and then they get these continuing payments going forward. Sometimes there's a note or a loan document. A promissory note is nothing but a loan document between the person who owes that and the person who is owed the money to facilitate that happening. So if you do find yourself in a situation where you didn't have that kind of insurance in place and some buyout needs to happen and you don't have the money, what's the solution? There are some business solutions, but they're certainly not ideal. And even those solutions are much better if they're planned for in advance and where you've been maybe pulling money out of the business and setting it aside for that purpose. That's the deferred compensation that I mentioned. And so there are business structures and insurance structures to help this. But the important thing is that you've thought about it and you've come up with a plan. As Chuck said earlier, not having a plan is a decision, but not one that's likely to benefit you. We'll have Lucy take us to the next slide. Go ahead, Chuck.
The one thing I would just mention on that point about promissory notes, far too often I'll find with a business owner, they'll have the boilerplate promissory note provision where it might be a term that causes way too much stress on the business owner that's surviving to stay afloat with the terms of it from a cash flow standpoint. So it's really important, we talk about these topics of succession planning. One of the things I'm going to reveal to you is it's a moving target. Things change. So you have to have it reevaluated. And even if you're a startup and you think you have a plan, it's really important that you sit down and take a look at it, particularly when there's any material events that are coming up, what your thoughts or strategies are, if you're going to take on a new business owner, a partner, if you're going to start to plan for an exit of a key employee. So it's really important to take a look at it then and give it like what I would call a stress test. And, you know, if you triggered those conditions right now under the current document or plan, what's that going to do based on how that business operates? If you put it through that stress test, it really will show whether or not it's going to be as smooth as you want it to be.
Yeah, and let me just add one more thing to that. That's really, really important. What you just said is, you know, adding additional stress. So again, I'm going back to the illustration, but if we didn't put something in place and there's that boilerplate promissory note and I pass away and Jacquelyn has to come up with $1 million for my wife, obviously that's going to put stress on Jacquelyn. But from my perspective, that not being funded affects my family. It affects my wife. It affects my kids. So this is more than just like the business part of it. Not planning is going to affect everybody that you care about. So it's worth it to sit down, do a stress test. What's going to happen if, you know, the what if planning question is the greatest planning question in the world. What happens if this happens? What happens if that happens? And it's really important because it's not just about, hey, can the business owner afford their debt? It's also, is my family going to have enough money to survive? Like, those are really important things to think about.
Absolutely. And so part of what controls some of those discussions is who is your successor going to be? And so there are lots of options here, but one thing that you definitely want to do is you want to have identified who that successor would be in the event something does happen. And for example, if you have kids and none of your kids are involved in the business, is there anybody that could step into the business or is interested in stepping into the business? And if not, there are options through estate planning where you could put the business into a trust and you could hire someone to run the business. And so there are a lot of options, but again, things that the thing we keep saying over and over here again is it's really important to talk about these things and figure out what the best plan is for you and your family. And so you want to talk about your active and non-active family members in the business and what role do they play, if any, if something happens. You want to identify any required training that might be necessary. You know, are these people, again, ready for prime time? And then what's the role of you as the person that might be leaving or retiring? If it's a retirement exit, do you still have some role that you want to play? Because there really are, I feel like people sometimes think, I'm leaving it and I have to walk away and I never can have anything to do with it again. And that's not the case. There really are transitional roles that you can play in a business that are very valuable. You carry so much knowledge with you if you've been the one to successfully operate this business. And you really, you want to get yourself in a position where you're not going to be intrusive into the business. And the new people who are going to come on and run the business really can run the business. You want to make sure you're giving them that grace. But at the same time, there are roles that you can play through board seats. You could stay on as a consultant, or you may exit the business, but still continue to get some profit from the business as part of the buyout. And that's part of that financial plan that you would structure with Micah. So just options to consider for staying involved in what the transition might look like. It's not always you hand the keys over to someone and you just have to walk away. There are more options than that.
I think what's important is we keep talking about all these different options, and there's so much more out there than you could come up with on your own. So again, we're going back to the importance of working with the right people who have experience and know what they're talking about. Because if you have an idea of what you want to happen, we can probably structure it to make it work that way. Like there's so much flexibility in this, as long as you do it ahead of time. If you don't do it ahead of time, the flexibility goes out the window. We don't have the ability to be flexible if we don't have a plan in place. But when we have a plan, we can pretty much structure it however makes sense. We can plan for just about everything. So even if you're like, hey, I'm not retiring for 25 years, or I'm never going to sell, I'm going to die at my desk, as Chuck said, cool. Let's still talk about what happens ultimately when that does happen, because we can be really flexible now. We can't be the day of.
And so some keys to successfully planning the transition are listed here. you want to involve your family members in this decision-making process. Sometimes people don't want to burden the family with this, or they're worried that there'll be conflict, but you really do want to have people involved in this decision. For example, you really want to make sure that you're not assuming somebody wants to remain involved in the business who actually doesn't want to remain involved in the business. Often we'll see kids involved in the business who are really working out the business through the end of their parents' lifetime and don't have any desire to continue. They're just helping to preserve that family legacy through the family member's lifetime. And so you want to know those things. You want to establish that method for dispute resolution. We told you that early in the process is the best time to talk about these things, because people aren't in a state of disagreement. You want to put into place at that time some method of how you'll resolve these things if there is a dispute. And then you want to make sure that you're documenting your plan appropriately. And that includes having it written down. If you have in your head an estate plan, but you don't get it memorialized and you end up dying without a will, your estate plan is not going to be the plan that's implemented. And who you think might be your beneficiaries under Pennsylvania law might not actually be your beneficiaries. A lot of people assume that everything will go to their spouse. And in Pennsylvania, if you die without a will, that is not the case. So you really want to make sure that you understand where your assets will go if something happens to you, and that you communicate what that plan is. Often people don't want to talk about their own mortality, so the kids don't have any idea of what's going to happen to the assets or what's going to happen to the business. And those are hard discussions to have, but we can help you have those discussions in a more comfortable way.
And not to scare the audience, but I'll use a real live example, Jacquelyn. I had a client post-death that we worked on an estate for, who passed away with a closely held business interest and did not have an estate plan. He didn't have any children, was married. His spouse thought she was the entire beneficiary under Pennsylvania law. In that example, that client's mother was still alive, and half of the estate under Pennsylvania law was shifted to the mother-in-law of the spouse. So now we had a business that was going to flow to the spouse that she had to equally run with her mother-in-law. So I don't know, there's probably a movie that creates some nightmares related to that, but little comic relief. But it happens, it's real life, these things can occur. And that was someone who didn't have a plan and thought they were leaving it to their spouse, or the spouse was the one that was key into the business, but legally had to share with the mother-in-law at that time. And it was not a good or smooth transition.
Yeah, super important. Definitely things to consider. So life after the transition. Part of this is also thinking about, and this is how Micah kicked us off. So we'll kind of bring everything full circle here. You really want to think about, after you make this transition, if you're making it prior to your death, what does the rest of your life look like? What are you going to do? Sometimes people will say, how are you going to ride off into the sunset, right? And some people have a very clear vision of what that looks like. They know they want to spend time with their grandkids, or they know that they want to start another business, or they want to sit around and drink coffee and read, and they don't want to do anything because they've worked their whole life, but they're very clear about what that looks like. And then other people don't know how they're going to spend that time. And so it's important that you have a plan that's positive for you and that leads you in a good direction. And I've heard Chuck talk, and Chuck, I wonder if you could just say a little word here, because I've heard you talk about push and pull, and the difference between being pushed and pulled out of this transition and the impact of that.
Yeah, so you want to make sure, like, I go back to the smooth, the word smooth. It's important to make sure that it's planned and it's smooth. There's ways to make sure that life after the transition is smooth as well. People sometimes are worried about selling their business because they don't want to let go. Well, you can sell it and still not let go. You can still have control, like you had mentioned, Jacquelyn, on your prior slides, with like employment agreements, new defined roles on the board. Maybe it's a consulting role. You're creating a new entity to interplay with your old business in a planned effort. So, you know, you want to make sure that it's not a forced exit. It's not a unplanned event, that you have another competing interest that is not aligned to what you had intended to structure. So it's really, really important to start these discussions and put that team around you that knows the right questions to help drive your goals out of those questions. So yeah, your life after the transition should be smooth. And if it's retirement, a lot of people think, I always congratulate my clients and say, every day's Saturday now, but they always get the itch to do something else, and you know, something's going on. So you know, it's really important to talk about whether or not they want flexibility to get the itch. Maybe they need to come back into the fold, etc. Limited basis, time frame. But I'm glad you raised that point. It shouldn't be a total push out or a pull out. It should be planned, smooth. Timeline should be smooth as well.
And while Chuck and I deal with more the functional sides of this, you know, it's Micah that deals with what the life implications are of this, and helps you to plan and figure out what your goal is, so that Chuck and I, from a business and an estate perspective, can put a process in place that meets those goals. And so really, that I can't say enough about the importance of cultivating that team, of cultivating a team of people that work well together and can interact to get those things done, to have those discussions, and to convey, you know, what you need and what your options are, and to help explore the best alternatives for you. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. This has been a wonderful opportunity to talk to you all about a family transition. You will see an offer on here that you can contact us to schedule a consultation about your family business transition at no cost. Similarly, if you're looking for a wealth management consultation, I know that Micah will talk with you or get you hooked up with someone who can talk with you about that. To figure out what your plans look like, how much you need, and what retirement might look like for you. And on the estate planning side, I know certainly that Chuck and his team are happy to talk with people about what that process looks like, and to help you understand what you need to do to make those kinds of plans. So thank you so much from me. I'll let Micah and Chuck bid you adieu as well. But again, I'm Jacquelyn Core, and I'm happy to help you with any of the business aspects of your transition if needed.
I'm Micah Larson. Again, I'm here to help you with wealth management and creating a vision for life after business. And I want to thank Jacquelyn and thank you, Chuck, so much for joining us today. I love these times, and I hope we get to do many, many more.
I'm Chuck Hadad again from the Lynch Law Group, and I'm more than happy to sit down with you and talk about your business succession and make sure that your estate planning goals are implemented as well. Thank you, Jacquelyn. It's a fantastic topic, phenomenal presentation. Micah, fantastic, very well-versed in the financial arena. I definitely recommend that everybody that's listening today reach out to Michael and start that stress test. And if there's any questions that you have and follow up, please do not hesitate to contact us.
Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And I think we're out. We might still be being recorded, but they can, let's see.